Hello everyone, this is part 4 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Roughly an hour away from the village, Naruto and Tayuya were just beginning to search for a clearing so they could get some sleep before they had to get up at night again. Tayuya was slightly annoyed by this. She didn't have the natural adjustment to being nocturnal that Naruto did. The entire time from the moment they left the village, she kept asking why they couldn't just walk during the day and stick to the trees. Kyuubi had prepared him for the question and his answer was simple. There are no trees in Wind Country. This wasn't technically true. There were palm trees and a few scarce forests around the border. However, for the most part, Wind Country was mainly desert or salt flats. There was also the problem that walking in a desert during the day was near suicide to 2 children. It would be much safer to walk at night when it was cooler. Of course, the cold posed an equal problem, but Kyuubi assured him that she would have a solution by the time they got to the border. It was drawing closer all the time, and Naruto was sending out vibes of pure excitement the closer they got. Kyuubi's estimate was about 3 more days, followed by another week before they reached Suna itself. Tayuya was less happy, although one could generally say she was always less happy than Naruto. One thing she was pleased about were their new clothes. The last time she had actually received new clothing was the year before. Otherwise she had to live out of the rags Naruto had found her in. She wanted to try them on, but Naruto assured her that they would get the chance in the morning. After all, there was no point when they were just going to sleep soon anyway. She was disgruntled by this. It always irked her whenever Naruto acted like he actually had a brain. Of course, after a few seconds the other him would slip through and everything would go back to normal. However, it was becoming increasingly common for Naruto's mask to slip. For some reason he found especially hard to maintain it around Tayuya. They finally found a decent spot. However, as soon as Tayuya reached into her pack to take things out, Naruto grabbed her wrist and threw the both of them to the ground. Tayuya was about to round on him and ask what the hell he was doing when a dull thud impacted to her left. Shakily she looked up to see a kunai embedded in a tree, obviously having passed through the spot where she had been standing only moments before. She looked across at Naruto in awe. He had just saved her life. However, he was already standing and looking furtively into the trees. The reason why became obvious when a slow, patronizing clap could be heard. Soon after, a very thin man with a shaved head emerged from the tree line, exactly in the spot Naruto had been staring into. The man smiled and looked at him, soon joined by his muscled companion, looking all the more intimidating with a massive sword slung over his shoulder. "Those are some reflexes, kid. I'm impressed." Surprisingly, Naruto simply snarled at the 2 men, his eyes flickering between his natural blue and their blood-red counterparts uncontrollably. "However, reflexes aren't going to save your life. Just come with us quietly and we won't have to hurt you." The man grinned evilly, his hands twitching slightly as he let his words sink in. Too much. Naruto stood his ground and the man sighed in an exaggerated manner. I wonder if that has ever worked." He shrugged nonchalantly. Well, what would the fun in that be, I guess." His wicked smile returned and he quickly motioned with his hand. Kojiro stated forward, taking large deliberate steps that made him seem heavier than he already was. Naruto faltered slightly. He was brave, but the man's imposing presence was enough to unnerve him. However, he didn't move for a second. Instead, his feet were rooted to the spot. His eyes managed to hold on to the defiant gleam even when the man was only a few feet away. He raised his hands and made a move to block Kojiro from Tayuya, but in an impressive display of speed he rushed forward and slammed Naruto harshly with the flat of the sword. Naruto grunted as his whole body was struck with the cold metal and sent tumbling across the clearing to impact solidly with a tree. Kojiro grinned. He didn't care that it was a kid he hit. All he felt was the satisfying sound of his blade striking flesh. He watched Naruto painfully slide out of the slight crater his body had made in the bark before turning to a rightfully scared Tayuya, who hadn't moved from her spot on the ground. Seeing Naruto struck, managed to pull her out of her frightened paralysis, but T was too late as the brute of a man roughly lifted her up with his brawny hands. He tucked her under his arm like a sack of vegetables, making sure to pin her arms to her side, and walked back over to his companion. "That was kind of boring, Mishoto. I was hoping the kid might put up some sort of fight." The smaller man shrugged languidly, a disinterested look settling over his features. I'm surprised you expected anything, Kajiro. He was just a brat after all. Even as he said this, he saw Naruto groggily rise from his position at the edge of the clearing. Although I may have spoken too soon. They both turned to look just as Naruto got to his feet and glared at the two men, his eyes now firmly red. When he didn't actually make a motion to move, Kajiro looked across expectantly at his partner. No, Kajiro, you have the girl, head over to the meeting point and I'll catch up. I think that it's best I beat a little sense into our young friend over there. The brutish man looked a little disappointed but nodded all the same, turning and walking out of the clearing with a limp Tayuya under his arm. Mishoto turned back around to return the defiant glare Naruto was sending him before cockily strutting over to him. You got guts, kid, but all that means is there'll be more to spread around this clearing when I'm done with you. Immediately a kunai was in both of his hands, apparently dropping straight out of his sleeves. Naruto didn't react, instead slipping into the basic taijutsu stance that he had been taught at the academy and Kyuubi had fixed. He should have known the teachers would purposefully try and sabotage his training, but that didn't matter now. Mishoto simply broke out into a grin that once again spoke of his arrogance. I had a feeling you might prove to be trouble, and wasn't I right? You must be a shinobi trainee, and from where we are I'd say you were from the Hidden Leaf Village. Naruto didn't move again, implementing the psychological warfare that Kyuubi had taught him, namely never rising to an opponent's taunts. If anything, ignoring him affected the taunter more than it would himself. Mishoto saw that his words weren't having an effect and shrugged. Naruto was caught off guard as the casual action quickly became deadly. As he shrugged, two more kunai dropped from his sleeves into his awaiting hands, and in one fluid motion all four were sent flying in Naruto's direction. He reacted quickly, diving out of the way just in time for two of the deadly knives to pass straight over his head. Unfortunately, the other two landed slightly closer to their mark. One embedded itself in his thigh as he turned to move, and the other caught his shoulder. The latter knife managed to draw a thin line of blood before catching his shirt and pinning Naruto to the tree behind him. That, coupled with the knife stuck in his leg, caused him to cry out, sending a few birds flying from their perches in the trees. A steady stream of blood was slowly soaking his pants leg below the wound, and Naruto couldn't even reach down to stem the bleeding thanks to the kunai holding him against the wood. Before he could reach over and pull it out, Mishoto was in front of him. 3 powerful blows to the stomach later and Naruto was slumped over. He would have dropped to the ground from the pain if it weren't for the fact he was pinned against the tree by both the kunai over his shoulder and Mishoto's fist, which was still firmly planted in his stomach. Mishoto wasn't done yet, and he drew back his fist only to bring it straight back into the same spot, eliciting a small spurt of blood from Naruto's mouth. His world was swimming and thoughts wouldn't form coherently in his mind. The pain was too much and he already felt his grasp on consciousness slip. In his mind he was searching for something, anything that could help him. He needed to escape, he needed to help Tayuya, he couldn't let the other man hurt her. He would never forgive himself if somebody else was hurt just because they were traveling with him. That's when a memory slid through his fuzzy mind. He was in his mindscape, watching with a grin as Kyuubi emerged from the forest around them with a small rabbit held happily in her mouth. She walked over and sat down on her hind legs, plopping the caught animal down on the ground beneath them. Sometimes it startled her just how realistic this place was. If she didn't know the truth, she may have in fact have believed this entire forest was real, except for the whole looping aspect. So Kit, is there anything specific you wanted to learn about today? Naruto simply looked confused. Kyuubi had never asked him this before, always having a lesson planned out in advance. What do you mean? Kyuubi gave him a wolfish grin. Nothing, it simply appears that you have a question you desperately wish to ask. I would like to get it out of the way before you learn something important. Naruto nodded along as she spoke until he heard the last part. Hey, who says my question isn't important? Kyuubi just shrugged in an infuriating manner, calmly poking her nose at the rabbit for a while until Naruto started to talk again. She had been right, there was something that had been bugging him all day, but he didn't want to ask through their mental connection. Kyuubi, we talk about my chakra a lot, but what about you? Do you have chakra? Kyuubi stopped what she was doing with the rabbit for a while, looking at the boy with a little bit of pride. That was surprisingly insightful, Naruto. I wouldn't have expected you to grasp that this quickly. Naruto smiled at the praise before once again realized there was a veiled insult hidden in her words. He said nothing, but his annoyed look made Kyubi chuckle before continuing. Mortal attempts to look intimidating truly are pitiful, although in your case I am willing to call it cute. Examining Naruto's unimpressed features, she huffed, he really could be no fun sometimes. But you are right, I do in fact have my own chakra. As a matter of fact, I am actually a being created purely from chakra. It is what makes me so powerful. She waited patiently for the inane and pointless question that would surely come next, although she was pleasantly surprised. So if you're inside of me, and you have chakra. He took a moment to think again. Am I capable of using your chakra? If Kyubi wasn't as old and as wise as she was, she may have hung her jaw in disbelief. That he could come to that realization so quickly was astounding. Perhaps the red-haired girl was having a positive effect on him after all, and here was Kyubi believing all he would get from her was her foul language. Quite astute, Kit. Yes, in time you may be able to access my chakra, with my permission of course. Naruto looked positively ecstatic. He would have jumped about in joy if he didn't have more questions. When can I start to use it? He was so happy. While he knew he had large chakra reserves and that they would continue to grow to immense proportions, he realized that the Kyubis must already be impossibly large. Kyubi on the other hand looked markedly grimmer. Not for a while, Kit. That stopped Naruto celebrating in its tracks, and he just stood there looking at her with a frown. Before he could inevitably question her, she beat him to it. My chakra was never supposed to be contained within such a small vessel. In time our respective chakras will merge, mostly thanks to the damnable seal your fourth placed on this cage. Until that time my chakra will pose a risk to your health if used. When will that be? Kyubi took a thoughtful pose, performing a few calculations in her mind. Based on how hard you train, I would say sometime in your late teens. Naruto's eyes opened wide and he looked at her disbelievingly. That long? Isn't there anything we could do to make it go quicker? Kyubi had to suppress a laugh at how childishly he was behaving. It actually took her a moment to remind herself that he was in fact a child. I'm afraid not, Kit. This is just something you will have to be patient about. His shoulders slumped in disappointment. If there was one thing Naruto Uzumaki hated, it was waiting. Kyubi sighed at his almost defeated expression and posture. She was certainly going to regret this, but the look on his face was like a kicked puppy. There may be ways to acclimatize your body to my chakra if you use it for short periods of time, to get yourself used to it. Naruto's grin returned in full and he rushed forward to hug the human-sized vixen. She promptly caught him with a tail to keep him at bay while she explained the rest of it. However, you will still have to wait for a few years, as your body is now, with its underdeveloped chakra coils. Even I can't predict what effect my chakra will have on your body. Naruto looked ready to slump again, but he figured that it was still an improvement over their original deal and he grinned before rushing in for that hug. The kunai in his shoulder finally ripped through the cloth of his shirt, allowing him to drop ungracefully to the ground. He lay there panting with Mishoto over him, smiling profusely, deriving some kind of sick pleasure from seeing his opponent, young and weak as he was, beaten on the floor. He gave him a sturdy kick in the stomach to make sure he stayed down and crossed his arms over his chest. He always liked to taunt an opponent while they were at their weakest, to crush any dwindling hope they might still have. Is this all you've got, Leaf Shinobi? I honestly expected more. Naruto tried to ignore him, instead sensing his thoughts inward. However, Mishoto wasn't making it easy, kicking him to punctuate certain words. His world was going increasingly dark and he didn't have much time. Kyubi, I need some of your chakra. He heard a growl from inside his head. I already told you, Kit, it would be dangerous. I don't know what will happen. Naruto grew increasingly desperate. I don't have any other choice. Please, Kyubi, I need to save Tayuya. There was silence for a few moments before a sigh reverberated in his head. This is not going to end well, but you are right, it seems there is no other choice. There was another pause and then there was the most excruciatingly painful experience Naruto would ever have the displeasure of living through. Fire shot forth from his core, spreading through his body like there was lava in his veins. It was indescribable. There was no one source of pain in his body, it was simply everywhere, in every cell, in every open space in his body, like it was being burnt to ashes only to reform again and start the process anew. He wasn't the only one noting the changes. Mishoto had noticed the slight heat haze that was beginning to form around the quivering child. He also noted the agony on the boy's face. Nothing that he was doing should have elicited that kind of response. He went on for another kick, only for a hand to roughly grab his ankle. Mishoto looked in shock at the hand that looked as though it should belong to a demon. The fingernails had grown into dark gray claws, extending and ripping into the fabric of his pants, then into his leg. He cried out from the unexpected pain and pulled away, just breaking the iron grip that was on his now injured foot. He took another look at the boy. The heat haze had become more prominent, actually appearing to turn the very air around him a light red. The strange whisker-like marks on his cheeks had widened and deepened into vicious scar-like grooves. The most worrying was the boy's eyes. They had slits for pupils and irises so red that you might think you were staring into a puddle of fresh blood. There was an animalistic savagery behind those eyes that Mishoto had never seen before, that didn't even belong on a human's face. It actually scared him, a full-grown man scared of a 7-year-old. It might have been laughable if anybody else wouldn't have felt the same in his place. Naruto moved and Mishoto expected him to get to his feet. Instead he only rose a little of the ground, adopting a more bestial four-legged stance. That's when Mishoto found there was something to be more scared of than the kid's eyes, when he opened his mouth to snarl and showed off two gleaming elongated canines. They were like fangs and the hunger in the boy's eyes showed that he desperately wanted to use them on him. Mishoto couldn't help but be curious about the change, no matter how drastic or terrifying might be. However, he was a trained fighter and any lapse in concentration such as studying your opponent too long could be fatal. He quickly lashed out with a repetitive volley of kunai pairs, smirking when the kid didn't even move and every knife struck home. 8 kunai littered his body, sending him reeling back against the tree. Blood poured from the open wounds but Naruto didn't even look fazed. One by one he drew out the kunai and Mishoto could only watch in wonderment as the jagged holes they had made in his flesh sealed themselves. Each time they did, a small plume of red steam would hiss out of each wound, leaving only the faintest hints that there was a cut in the first place. What are you? Naruto only growled in response and charged forward at blinding speed. Being an accomplished combatant, Mishoto normally would be prepared for such a charge, but he wasn't expecting it because of who his opponent was. He was also slightly frozen with fear. In a few seconds Naruto was in front of him. In the few after that, Mishoto was halfway across the clearing with 4 jagged lines across his stomach. He grimaced and clutched at the wound, desperately trying to stem the seemingly endless flow of blood that only served to coat his hands. Naruto stalked towards him, not even bothering to charge this time, a 7-year-old kid that managed to look like the Shinigami incarnate. The scrawny man tried to go for some shuriken in the pouch on his belt, but his hands, slick with his own blood, couldn't gain a grip on the zipper. It was too late. Naruto had already reached him and with one clawed hand he grabbed the front of Mishoto's jacket, halting any further attempt to stop the bleeding. The man could clearly see the sunlight reflecting off of the boy's enlarged teeth. His young face seemed permanently set in that ferocious snarl. "Where's Tayuya?" The voice was truly demonic, gravely, completely out of place on such a young child. It only added to his menacing aura and frightening features. This was somebody you didn't lie to. The eyes told him as much. "The river. There's a spot at the river we meet at whenever we get split up. It's next to a waterfall, you can't miss it." The words gushed out uncontrollably. It was like Naruto's eyes were actually pulling the information out of him, leaving him strangely hollow. Naruto just scowled, managing to look even more menacing than he had before. Mishoto was still trying to wrap his head around the fact that a 7-year-old boy was lifting him up with only one arm and didn't even look to be exerting himself. Satisfied that he had the information he needed, Naruto clenched his fist further on the jacket before winding back and throwing the man clear across the clearing. He impacted with a tree heavily, nearly splintering the wood and ripping the tree from its roots. He was unconscious before he even made contact, the power and the malevolence coming from the child proving too much and shutting down his mind from the strain. How could a mere mortal stand in the presence of even a fraction of the Kyuubi's chakra? Naruto was moving before Mishoto slumped to the ground, diving through trees and smashing through the ones he didn't want to go around. He left a small but direct path of destruction through the forest, moving at speed he never could have dreamed of before. He moved from branch to branch, crashing through thick trunks like they were just another part of the air. His aura of Kyuubi's chakra floated out behind him as he ran like the wake of an enormous boat. He only had the vague directions of Mishoto to go on, but it didn't matter. By now he could smell Tayuya. He had been around her long enough that her scent was practically ingrained into his memory. He could probably trace just a hint of it from miles away. The sound of rushing water and the crash of a waterfall meeting rocks was next to come into his sensory range, and before long the trees dropped out from under him and he was next to a massive river. It took him a second to locate Tayuya and the slightly less familiar scent of the more brutish of the two men. He reeked of sweat, alcohol and women. Naruto growled loudly at the man who currently had his back turned to him, looking expectantly into the tree line. He turned suddenly, expecting some kind of wild animal from the sound it had made. What he didn't expect was the weakling of a kid that they were there to kidnap, surrounded by a veil of burning chakra and the most feral expression on his face imaginable. Hey, it's you. Naruto just snarled, a deep sound that even a man as large as Kajiro found intimidating. By now Tayuya was struggling to get a glimpse of what was going on. She was facing the opposite direction and could only hear animalistic growling. Where's Mishoto? Another growl was his reply. Naruto's attention was on the red-headed bundle under his arms. What did you do with him? By now Tayuya was really struggling to see something, writhing in the man's grip like a snake. Hey, let me fucking see you, dick. Kajiro absent-mindedly slammed the hilt of his massive sword into the girl's stomach, producing a quiet whimper before the girl went limp. Naruto's eyes widened and he let loose what would best be described as a roar. It actually created a wall of air that immediately rocked Kajiro, loosening his grip on the earth but not quite knocking him off his feet. You hurt Tayuya. It was Kajiro's turn to widen his eyes at the sheer fury in Naruto's words. He had worked out by now that Mishoto was either unconscious somewhere or dead. Both scenarios scared him. Mishoto was the better fighter out of the two of them, so Kajiro saw no way of coming out of this unscathed. Hey look kid, it's alright, I'll give you the girl back. ... Quote. He very carefully set Tayuya down, ... and I'll just walk away. Nobody needs to get hurt. Naruto's eyes narrowed and he took a hesitant step forward while Kajiro took one back. Unfortunately for the larger man, Tayuya chose that moment to roll over and painfully cough, forcing a small amount of blood to trickle from her mouth. Naruto could now clearly see the bruises on her face from where Kajiro had hit her every time she had sworn while walking to the river. If any of Naruto's more demonic features had dissipated in those brief moments, the now decided to return full force. You hurt her. You'll get no mercy from me. Kajiro was downright scared now. His plan had failed and it now looked like he was going to die for sure. He saw no other choice. As fast as possible he drew his sword and leveled the sharpest part of the blade against Tayuya's neck. He also placed his foot on her body to stop her moving or accidentally nicking herself on the sword. Stay there or I'll kill the girl. Naruto said nothing, not moving an inch. He took one step back, then another before very slowly dropping down onto all four limbs. Hey, I said don't move. What are you doing? Again Naruto didn't rely, but when Kajiro strained his ears he could hear a steady growling from the boy's throat. He should have been more focused on his surroundings, as when he looked, one moment Naruto was there, crouched down like he was going to pounce, the next he was right next to Kajiro. In a moment of panic he brought his sword around, forgetting about Tayuya entirely, but Naruto rather calmly, despite his feral state, caught the edge of the blade with his own hand. Already the wound was healing itself as he pulled the weapon out of the massive man's hands and snapped it into two pieces. Kajiro could only look in shock as the weapon was shattered, leaving his hands empty. In that moment of hesitation Naruto grabbed the man and threw him into the river. He didn't stop there though. A second later he was sprinting across the surface of the river with the water steaming where his feet made contact. He grabbed Kajiro's flailing hand, and where skin met chakra cloak there was the sickening smell of burning flesh, followed by the bulky man's screams. A few steps later and the man was precariously hanging over the edge of the falls. Naruto was seemingly unaffected by the river's current and his feet didn't move from their spot. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. The man was actually crying now, the pain in his arm and the fear of the drop beneath him reducing him to a blubbering wreck. The small part of the Kyuubi that had a hold of Naruto's consciousness at that moment was disgusted by the sight. I said no mercy. Naruto glared evilly, but his hand stayed rooted to the man's wrist. It trembled slightly but the fingers didn't move. He was under the slight influence of a more malevolent being, but Naruto was still Naruto and he didn't want to kill anybody, even this wreck of a man. With a dreadful growl he roared again, actually making Kajiro soil himself, much to the sensitively nosed Jinchuriki's chagrin. He snarled again, quieter this time, and violently threw the man back onto dry land to impact sickeningly with a tree trunk in the same manner as his partner only minutes ago. He was already forgotten by Naruto as he dashed away towards the still prone form of Tayuya, the cloak of chakra fading as he took his first step off of the rushing river water. He ran as quickly as he could, which now seemed painfully slow compared to when he was under Kyuubi's influence. He was pale and his legs shook uncontrollably, but he made it over to Tayuya's side and hefted her onto his shoulders. It was difficult, but he managed to make it back to where they had been about to set up camp. By now, even with his immense and near unquenchable stamina, Naruto could barely stay awake. He forced himself on, not wanting to lose himself quite yet, not until he was sure Tayuya was okay at least. He noticed that Mishoto was gone, but he didn't care. All he wanted to do was slump against a tree and allow unconsciousness to take him. His skin still tingled uncomfortably from the oppressive chakra that had been surrounding him, and he felt naked without it. Luckily, just as he was on the brink, Tayuya stirred and looked up at him with bleary, uncomprehending eyes. Shush, shithead. Naruto let out a half-hearted chuckle, even after all that she was still calling him that name. That was all he had left, and after he made sure to give Tayuya a smile, he promptly passed out, slumping to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. 5 more minutes, Tayuya-chan, the floor just felt so comfortable right now that. What the fuck did you just call me? Naruto was up in a flash, avoiding the very angry fist belonging to his traveling companion that was squarely aimed at his gut. He stood there a moment, roughly 5 feet away from her, as they both just stared at one another in an awkward silence. Naruto assumed his famous position with his hand rubbing the back of his head so hard that he might have drawn blood. Sorry about that, Tayuya, wasn't thinking straight. He smiled sheepishly and Tayuya just grunted and turned away in a huff. Naruto noticed for the first time that there was food roasting over a small fire that Tayuya had set up. He smiled, drooling slightly from the smell, and went to sit down. Tayuya continued to ignore his as they ate, but he could clearly see that as time passed her posture relaxed and she started to glance at him. This is really good, Tayuya. She immediately turned away from him, and he thought it was because she was still mad. What he didn't see was the slight pink tint that had managed to invade her cheeks. Once again their small campsite was invaded by awkward, unsettling silence that created a tension so thick Naruto actually tried to cut it with a kunai. Tayuya turned and saw the strange action, her eyes narrowing. What the fuck are you doing, shithead? Caught red-handed, Naruto smiled peevishly again and quickly hid the kunai in his pack. Nothing, just practicing. Tayuya dropped her shoulders slightly. She was really going to have to teach him how to lie someday. Even she knew shinobi had to be effective liars sometimes. Tayuya sighed and stood up. It was late into the day, but she figured they could still get some training in. She made a move to go off to one side of the clearing, but Naruto stopped her. Wait, Tayuya, I think we should take a break from training today. We can make it to the border by morning if we just walk from here. What he left out was that it was Kyuubi's suggestion. Tayuya just shrugged. If she had gone along with his suggestions up until now, then this was hardly different. They both packed up and carefully hid the fire they had made before falling into step with one another. They continued along for a while. Both were either content not to talk or not risking the consequences if they did. Tayuya had slowly gotten used to the dark of the forests in her short time with Naruto and was stumbling or slipping much less than usual. Even so, Naruto was constantly aware of her position, making sure she was in fact following him and wasn't getting herself hurt. More than a few times she had found herself tripping over a root, about to greet the floor with her face only to be caught in a surprisingly gentle embrace. Naruto never even wanted a thank you. He simply did it because he didn't want to see anybody hurt. In their time together he finally realized there was an, especially, in front of that when it applied to Tayuya. Being the energetic girl that she was, Tayuya quickly became bored with the never-ending silence and there was nothing to actually see in the forest. In fact, the only thing that she could do was listen out for the various animal calls that pervaded the dense trees. Hey shithead. Naruto didn't turn from where he was looking and carried on walking, carefully navigating past shrubs and loose rocks. Yeah. Tayuya grumbled slightly over his lack of attention. What happened back there? She flinched inwardly and cursed herself for stuttering again. It was becoming something she despised but found she occasionally couldn't help around Naruto. For his part, Naruto simply froze for a moment before continuing on at a slower pace, something Tayuya had difficulty noticing. However, she did notice the slightly hesitant tone of his voice when he answered. What do you mean? Tayuya narrowed her eyes, something that didn't make walking any easier in the near pitch black. I mean with those two fucktards back there. 1 second they were beating the crap out of you and carrying me off, the next thing I know is there was some kind of wild animal growling and I'm unconscious. This time Naruto stopped entirely and Tayuya nearly walked straight into his back, only managing to swerve around him and trip from her awkward footing. Once again she was immediately in Naruto's arms, being slowly lowered to the floor where he sat down next to her with his legs crossed. Naruto looked contemplative for a while. He had no idea how to even begin to explain all of this to her, or even if he wanted to. Despite all their time together, Naruto knew barely anything about his companion. She never opened up and never talked about herself. He sighed slightly. It was probably a reciprocal thing. He too hadn't talked about his past in the slightest, so maybe one of them simply needed to go first. What do you know about the nine-tailed fox? Tayuya's face was hidden by darkness, but with his eyesight Naruto could clearly see the confusion on her face. What the fuck's a fox got to do with this? Is that what attacked those guys? Naruto chuckled lightly. Sort of, but no. Tayuya was getting irritated with all the riddles and half-answers, and Naruto could see that. The nine-tailed fox was a demon. He heard a very loud coughing in his head that sounded just as irate as Tayuya looked. Sorry, he was at a blank. He actually didn't fully understand what Kyuubi was himself. We were once known as the Biju. Naruto was surprised at the melancholy in Kyuubi's words. It wasn't a tone she used at all. Quote. A Biju. Again there was confusion written across Tayuya's features. I don't really understand it myself, but from what I know the nine-tailed fox was the most powerful of them. While her curiosity was slowly being sated, she still felt as though Naruto was avoiding her initial question. However, he didn't give her a chance to interject. 7 years ago, the fourth Hokage. He was concentrating on what he said and missed the slight flinch that Tayuya let out after hearing the name, sealed the nine tails into a baby to contain its power. Recovered from her shock at hearing the fourth Hokage, Tayuya returned to her default scowl. She was thinking what about this fairy tale had to do with anything. Of course, it only took a few moments for her mind to start putting the pieces together. The animalistic growling she had heard, Naruto's age, the supposed power of this nine-tailed fox. Her head suddenly shot up in shock, staring straight at Naruto, whose eyes were firmly fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet her gaze. Yeah, I'm the kid that it got sealed into. I'm the container for the Kyuubi no Yoko. Tayuya stared for a while, searching Naruto's eyes for any signs of deceit. It didn't take long. He was a terrible liar, and Tayuya could tell that he was telling the truth, or at least he believed he did. She sighed. That meant she was either traveling with some kind of lunatic or a container for an unearthly powerful demon spirit. Perfect. At least it explained why she wasn't currently on her way to either a slave camp or to be some whore for some potential buyer. So you saved me. Naruto's head shot up so fast he thought he had gotten whiplash. He hadn't been expecting that reaction. He had thought she would run away or shout things at him, maybe even try to kill him like the rest of his village had. Why yeah. Suddenly Tayuya did something he never thought he would ever see her do, never mind actually experience for himself. She shot forward and wrapped her arms around Naruto's shoulders and held him there while he stayed rigid. It was partly out of shock, partly because he had never been on the receiving end of a hug before, and partly because he was afraid of what Tayuya might do if he moved at all. Finally she released him and sat back, the darkness of the forest luckily hiding her blush from Naruto's eyes, not that he would have noticed in his state of surprise. Thank you. She wasn't naive like most 7-year-olds, she knew exactly what happened to those taken away by slavers. It wasn't like the watered-down stories parents told their children to keep them in line. You were either forced into back-breaking labor until the day you dropped to the dust, or you were used as some pervert's sick pleasure toy until he lost interest with you. And even that explanation was still a little watered down. She shuddered at the thought. A hug was the least she could do to thank the boy who had saved her from either of those two fates. Naruto for his part was speechless. He hadn't even thought about it when he went to save Tayuya, it had just seemed instinctual. Now she was thanking him, actually thanking him. He had never been thanked before. Nobody had ever been grateful for anything he had done before. His hand moved on its own up to the back of his head where he nervously rubbed like he was trying to polish his scalp to the bone. It was nothing. Tayuya looked at him sternly before scooting closer to him until she was right next to him. He leaned in for another hug, wrapping her hands around him and resting her head against his shoulder. No, it wasn't. You saved me. Naruto was still at a loss for words, but now that Tayuya had thanked him, her curiosity had gotten the better of her. But just because you have this thing inside of you. Naruto heard an irritated huff inside his head. How does that mean you could beat those guys? Naruto looked up at the stars that filtered through the leaves for a moment, then back at the girl on his shoulder. She gave me some of her chakra. Tayuya sat up a little straighter. Naruto spent the next half an hour explaining how he had first met the creature living inside him, all about his mindscape and what Kyubi taught him. He left out anything about his village or the way he had been treated, but if Tayuya noticed she didn't pry, she still had her own secrets to keep. She seemed most interested in the power that Naruto had used to save her, but when she asked him to show her, he explained about why it was dangerous. Again, she didn't show it, but her respect for Naruto went up after hearing that. When he was finished, he sat back, awaiting Tayuya's judgment, something he found rather nerve-wracking. So wait, you've been getting extra fucking lessons this whole time? Naruto felt a large drop of sweat develop on the side of his head that just seemed to hang there as he stared awkwardly at her. What? He shook his head, smiling. She was still Tayuya after all. Yeah, but they're in my head, so I'm not really sure what I can do. Tayuya just looked disgruntled that her companion got extra knowledge than her. But Kyubi says that when we get to Suna we can get a proper teacher who can give us jutsu and stuff. His enthusiasm was irrepressible, and Tayuya immediately found her spirits brightening a little, even if her usual semi-scowl was back in place. Well then, come on, we might as well get going. Naruto nodded cheerfully, feeling as though a massive weight had lifted off of his shoulders and stomach. He almost felt as though he could breathe more easily. Of course, many hours later, when the forest dropped away and their vision was replaced with nothing but sand, and more sand, that weight returned tenfold. Tayuya was equally shocked. The slight happy attitude she had developed over the last day of talking vanished as she gawked at the intimidating desert that stretched out before them. We're supposed to spend a fucking week in that. Naruto was equally incredulous, although Kyubi was staying suspiciously quiet to his questioning. I guess so, but it's nearly sunrise, so we should probably get some sleep now. Tayuya didn't move, she just stood there with wide eyes staring out at the impossible scenery. How the fuck are we going to survive out there, you shithead? We can't carry a week's worth of water. Naruto rubbed the back of his head nervously, more concerned with how they were going to get food. Fortunately, Kyubi chose this moment to finally start answering his questions. Oh, okay. Kyubi says that I should be able to smell out oases and there will be desert animals around there that we can eat. Tayuya narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously. Did Kyubi also tell you how we aren't going to freeze to death? Naruto heard an irritated growl, obviously aimed at Tayuya for the mocking way she said her name. Yeah. Apparently we're supposed to wear a load of our clothes all at once. Tayuya was about to retort that the idea sounded stupid, in her own special way of course, but she stopped dead. It actually sounded like a decent plan, she just didn't want to admit it. She merely grunted as a response and went about setting up the camp. She wasn't sure why she was annoyed right now, but she didn't really care. She just wanted to get across the desert and be done with it. Her mood thankfully eased by the time the two of them were snuggling together for warmth. The fact that it had gotten a lot colder the closer they got to the border wasn't missed by either child. She drifted off to sleep while Naruto had his first lesson on desert survival. Kyubi assured him many times that he was going to need it, not just now but for a long time if he planned on staying in Suna. It was the middle of their week-long trek across the Wind Country's desert and the patience of both children were wearing thin. Tayuya had seemed perpetually annoyed ever since Naruto had seen her shivering one night and had offered her his warm jacket. She had refused, of course. No matter who it was, she wasn't willing to look weak in front of anybody. Of course, Naruto merely kept his arm extended as they walked, not making a move to return the jacket to his shoulders. Tayuya had grumbled a lot before accepting the jacket. If he wasn't going to use it, then she might as well have. Luckily, she missed Naruto's smirk. She didn't realize it, but he was beginning to understand how she thought a lot more clearly now. Of course, she had immediately felt better after putting the jacket on, but Naruto had come to expect no gratitude from anything less than saving the girl's life. Not that he minded, of course, he was simply glad for the company. He felt as though he had found a true friend in Tayuya. Her no-nonsense attitude meant that she could just take him for who he was. She also wouldn't admit it, but he could see that she had gone through some serious hardships in her life. It meant that she could at least understand him. He always thought about asking her about it, after telling her about himself, but he thought against it, deciding that she could open up to him in her own time without him pressuring her. Currently they were hunkered in a small cave waiting for a sandstorm to pass. They had learned in the first few days that the phenomena came fast and without warning. Luckily they only lasted for an hour or so before clearing up. It was the lack of moisture in the air and the constant chill that gave the two worry. Days were spent sleeping under a rock or in any shelter they could find to keep the scorching sun off of them. Nights were spent walking, usually in silence. They moved from oasis to oasis, eating and drinking what sparse supplies they could find. Thankfully QB proved correct and Naruto could sniff them out, although sometimes it would send them quite the distance off of their path. Naruto never was sure how QB could possibly know where she was going when everything just seemed to stretch out in a uniform blend of sand and sky. When he asked, she just shrugged, telling him it was something he wouldn't understand. Answers like that always served to irritate him, much to QB's amusement he found. Another pastime of the old vixen was serving to make any space the two children shared awkward. Even if Naruto didn't understand most of the words or euphemisms she used, he got the gist of what she was implying. It didn't help that the two would end up wrapped in each other's arms when the temperatures dropped before they went to sleep. What was most annoying was that Naruto had no way of blocking off their mental link to one another so her laughter couldn't be silenced. How long do you think this bullshit sandstorm's going to last? Tayuya shook him out of his thoughts and he looked up, maybe a bit too hastily as he managed to bang his head on the low roof. He rubbed the spot where the rock had struck and winced painfully while Tayuya stifled a laugh. I don't know, maybe another 30 minutes. Who can tell with these things? What I'd give just for some rain. It never rained out here. It seemed even the word rain was lacking from the desert's vocabulary. There was only water in the oases because of underground streams that were somehow protected from the harsh sun. Oh please, this is shit all compared to the fucking rock hail back in Iwa. Tayuya immediately clasped her hands over her mouth. She hadn't meant to let that slip. Naruto immediately took notice of the strange behavior until he realized Tayuya had just spoken about herself. She had just accidentally let him know something about her past without meaning to. It didn't really help him though. While he knew where Earth Country was, he didn't know anything about it. You're from Earth Country. She stared at him harshly. Yeah, so what? Big fucking deal. Naruto just shrugged his eyes, genuinely innocent, and Tayuya found that her rocky outer shell was more difficult to maintain than usual. Her shoulders slumped. When she actually thought about it, she had to admit it felt good to actually talk about her past, even if it was just that shred of information. What was it like? She looked up at him and nearly blanched at the puppy-like curiosity on her face. Dry. Naruto smiled a broad grin. He had just asked a question about Tayuya's past and she had answered, probably truthfully. It was like a small breakthrough and he couldn't help but feel a little proud. That dam he had envisioned early had managed to gain a few new cracks. Drier than this. What about where you lived? Tayuya wasn't speaking, but somehow she managed to go even quieter, the small cave becoming deathly silent. Naruto immediately sensed the hesitation over the question and decided that he was asking too much without giving anything in return. I never know what to think when I imagine the Leaf Village. Tayuya finally started breathing again as she looked questioningly at Naruto. It was pretty a lot of the time. At night you could see the stars, but the edge of the sky always had this orange tint. None of the houses ever looked the same and there was so much variety in every street it was like you were walking into a whole different country. From the Hokage Monument it would stretch on for what I used to think was forever. He smiled as he thought of those good memories from his time there. It had become so quiet after he stopped talking that even Tayuya's meek voice had no difficulty reaching Naruto's ears. In the winter we would always get snow. It would cover everything and make it seem really clean and fresh. Then when it melted the ground would go a funny shade of red and the other children used to paint themselves with it like we would see the soldiers in the pictures do. Naruto's smile was softer now. He could tell that it had been incredibly difficult for Tayuya to tell him even that small snippet of information. It would be pressing his luck to ask any more. I think the storm's letting up. We should get ready to move on. Tayuya just nodded slowly, her mind obviously elsewhere, but she mechanically went through the procedure of packing up the gear. Naruto was happy inside. Perhaps now he could finally start to learn more about her. Not even half an hour later another sandstorm passed over them. Unfortunately they couldn't find another cave in time. They were forced to walk through it, which was made all the more difficult by the fact that it completely threw off Naruto's sense of smell, leaving them to rely solely on Kyuubi's directions. Visibility was so low that they had to hold hands just so they wouldn't lose one another. Naruto's heightened senses meant absolutely nothing in this kind of weather. Finally they crawled into a cave, tired out and partially blinded from all the sand. Naruto might have regretted his earlier fascination with sand if it weren't for his natural determination. Tayuya on the other hand was much more willing to berate him for it. Fucking Sunagakure, it had to be motherfucking Suna. You couldn't have chosen Kumo, could you? No, it had to be the one with all the goddamn motherfucking piece of shitty ass sand. As she was saying this, she was pouring the surprising amount of said sand out of her sandals, something Naruto figured would probably be a good idea for him as well. Well, it's nearly sunrise anyway, so we might as well have found shelter. Tayuya merely shot him a deathly glare and Naruto quickly quietened down. She was in one of her moods and nothing Naruto said right now was going to help him. Unfortunately, neither of them were even remotely tired yet, despite all the walking they had done. The chill of the desert night permeated even the rocks surrounding them, forcing them to huddle together. A fire was impractical as they would only end up killing themselves from the smoke, not that they actually had any wood for them to burn. The only trees they had actually come across in the entire time out in the desert were a few scarce palms. They couldn't even sit in silence. The sandstorm outside was causing a dull roar that echoed around the tiny cave, grating on their nerves to the point that they couldn't even hear themselves think. Don't you fucking dare go into your mindscape, shithead. You're not leaving me alone in here with this crappy noise. Naruto smiled sheepishly and would have rubbed the back of his head if his hand wasn't otherwise occupied with hugging Tayuya for warmth. He was actually planning to escape and talk with Kyuubi for a bit, and Tayuya had nearly caught him in the act. What do you want to talk about then? Immediately Tayuya became defensive, narrowing her eyes at Naruto. Who says I wanted to talk? I just don't like being left alone. Immediately she turned away and scowled. She hadn't meant to sound like that, as if she needed Naruto. It was besides that point that right now she did in fact need his warmth. It was almost unnatural how warm Naruto could manage to be despite everything that should say otherwise. He was better than a blanket most nights, one more thing Tayuya would be loath to admit. Naruto just shrugged, an impressive action considering his arms were otherwise engaged, and Tayuya for her part sighed. When you talked about your village you seemed to be happy, so why'd you leave? She could feel Naruto stiffen in her arms, something that made their position markedly more uncomfortable. Also, you only talked about the place, what about the people? Naruto relaxed a little, but not to how he was before. Strangely, Tayuya also noted that he had become colder, as if his emotions were tied in with his body heat. There was old man Hokage. He would come around every month to check on me and we would talk for a while. Nothing specific, we would talk about food or how my studies were going. Tayuya noticed that he had completely avoided her first question and was too busy considering this that his counter question came as a complete surprise. What about you? Was there anybody special in Earth Country? Tayuya paled a little and Naruto could already see her unwillingness to answer. However, he had told her something and now she felt like she owed him something in return. I had my grandfather. He wasn't much and he would ignore me half the time, but we had a few good moments. Her face fell and she mumbled something Naruto wasn't supposed to hear but couldn't help anyway. When he was sober. What about your parents? Tayuya's face shot around so fast that Naruto thought it might twist off. There was fire in her eyes and her glare was hard as ice. What about yours, asshole? All the anger bled out of her features when she saw the emptiness and sadness in Naruto's eyes, unbidden and unshielded unlike normal. I don't know. I never knew them. The old man told me they died after I was born, but he never told me anything else about them. Tayuya blinked a few times. Why, you're an orphan. Naruto nodded sadly. Tayuya was having difficulties believing him. He acted so cheerful and impossibly happy, yet everything he told her about himself only made his life sound worse and worse. Me too. Naruto's head rose slowly and she saw something in his eyes, understanding. It gave her a little strength to keep speaking, something she never thought she would do when it came to this topic. They died when I was young as well. I don't even remember their faces. I was never told how or why they died, but it had something to do with the last war. Naruto didn't even realize he was doing it, but he found himself hugging Tayuya a little tighter. Once again the sandstorm outside began to die down, but Naruto didn't say anything while Tayuya seemed too distracted to even notice. So what about your grandfather? He thought Tayuya was going to round on him again, but instead she just lifted her head wearily, her eyes dulled and tired. Someone once told me he was a great man, a powerful ninja that was feared during the Second Shinobi War. Her head dropped again, but he hated me, said I reminded him of the daughter he lost. He drank all of the time, and when he drank he would get angry. She left the sentence hanging, but Naruto could see where it was heading. I had no friends to turn to. Their parents told them to stay away from me because of something my grandfather did during the war. Naruto could understand this. There was nobody in his age group that he could talk to, nobody who would come up to him and try and befriend him anymore. Those that did were punished, those that didn't would whisper behind his back, spread rumors of the monster of the leaf. Children would sometimes run away from him out of fear, others would actively try to hurt him to appear brave. It was all the same to Naruto, the loneliness, the pain, and sadness. Everybody in my village hated me. The adults would beat me or ignore me, and the children would whisper and throw stones in my direction. People would come and try to burn down my apartment and scratch things into the wall. They all believed I was the so-called demon that was sealed inside of me. I had no friends except for the Hokage. The orphanage even kicked me out when I was 4, said I disrupted the other children. This time it was Tayuya who found herself subconsciously hugging Naruto in closer. How do you do it? How do you stay so happy? Naruto's shoulders slumped. I was never happy in that village. The day before I left I was about to kill myself. Tayuya involuntarily gasped. It was quiet but still noticeable. It was the Kyuubi that saved me. We talked for a while and she convinced me to leave, to find somewhere I can live happily, somewhere I can find friends. He looked up and smiled at Tayuya, a genuine smile that seemed to warm the cave slightly. And I met you, my first real friend. Again Tayuya gasped, but this time managed to keep it in her head. The fact that he considered her a friend, despite how she treated him, despite how she talked and acted. She didn't know whether to be happy or smack him for being so soft. She decided on both. Naruto was still rubbing his cheek 30 minutes after they had left the cave, and Tayuya was still internally smiling. They had both lapsed into a pleasant silence, content with their own thoughts for the time being, at least until Naruto noticed something off in the distance. Hey Tayuya, I see something. Tayuya just groaned. He would do this all the time, announcing every little thing he saw, from strange birds to single trees that jutted out of the sand like the solitary bones of some great creature. Unless it's Suna or a freaking dango stand, I don't give a shit. Naruto peered harder through the darkness, trying to see what it was. A bit further on he had a better picture and was now grinning from ear to ear. Well, it isn't dango. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.